Shan, you've had a wonderfully adventurous life. But from the little bits I've found out more recently, it seems to me that perhaps the most adventurous and the most fun time in your life would have been when you and David, whom you had just married after Cambridge, went off to Nigeria and played at running the empire. Can you tell me how that happened and what it was like?
That's a refreshing take. I think actually that was the spirit in which we started. We had been promised great things. You go to a great university and you come back and, you know, people are ready to give you good jobs and give you a good life. So it was really quite a risk going off into North Africa, which really nobody had been to before in the sense that we were planning to. So it was a sense of adventure. And a desert climate, I had never lived in a desert climate, all Muslim, I had never lived in an all Muslim society. So it was a challenge. And I think that's what attracted both of us.
And what exactly were you all doing? And what was his status, as it were?
It was the time when Britain was quietly giving up the empire. Well, not always quietly, but in this part, yes. And he, what he did was join the British Civil Service, but not as an administrative person, as a teacher, which took him to the parts of Africa, of Nigeria that he was really interested in on a non-hostile basis. Nobody knew what the politics of withdrawing from empire would be like. As it happened, in the part that we were in, it was extremely amicable. And they involved us as foreigners and the white people as well in all of the ceremonies. And I think it was one of the most vivid times of my life, and I've had a few that I'll
Where
never
exactly
forget.
was it?
It was in 1956. No, 59.
59, right.
Yeah, we had just finished Cambridge. He had come out and we had got married. And we thought this would be wonderful, just to go to a place that no one had been to before. And literally it was on the edge of the Sahara Desert.
So northern Nigeria.
Very, very far north. And when we went there, there wasn't a crop on the, it was desert. Right. And it was sand dunes. And then I remember in the third month, the rain came. And you and I are used to monsoons. A monsoon doesn't even come close. I mean, the sky opened and a wall of water fell down. And by the next morning, practically, the corn was up like that.
Right.
You know, just like that. It was amazing. And we'd had a swimming pool that the previous occupant had built, which had been dry. It was full of water. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. But that was how the desert, I mean, they talk about the desert flowering. And that's what it did, give it water. We grew strawberries, we grew vegetables, we grew cucumbers, petunias. We couldn't stop them flowering and growing all over the property. So it was an adventure.
And presumably, of course, as a representative of empire, if that's the right word,
Yeah.
you had lots of staff.
Yes, we were, the contract, and you're going to laugh at this, David's contract, which was as good as any you could get in a colonial officer, for 1 year, full-time teacher, was £1,000.
Right, yes.
You wouldn't take a job like that for £1,000 a week.
But you got your housing?
We got our housing, we had a driver, we had a gardener, we had a houseboy, and we had all kinds of other services we could call in when we needed them.
And you said he was a teacher, but was he the only white teacher, as it were, in the school?
No, there were about, there were a few, no, 2 from France,
Right.
3 from India, I think it was, ourselves, and the rest were all
So
Hausa.
was he the principal, as it were?
No, it was a white, it was a seasoned
Right.
education officer who
English.
was, yeah.
Right.
And it was separate. The boys' school was where he taught and the girls' school was where I taught.
And you taught in the girls' school?
I did. And traditionally they had not been given, the girls I mean, had not been given a higher education. They got to what would have been our Form 3 And they were diverted then from the boys. They'd learnt English, they'd learnt Hausa, they'd learnt basic mathematics and geography and history. But they were separated out at that point. And the boys learned woodworking and farming, and the girls learned cooking and sewing and hairdressing. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, to make them marriageable. So,
one of the reasons I, as it was so inspired to think of Nigeria as a great place, was coming across in the albums in your old house with your mother so assiduously collected, a fantastic picture of what I think was royalty. Did you have an emir?
Yes,
and
yes,
you
we
and
did.
David are sitting on either side of it.
I know. That was one of the great points of my career. Nothing to do with me, but at that point I was wearing a sari all the time. And he just took to me because as emir, he had been drafted into the West African Rifles during the World War. So he had spent most of his time in India. And he really liked the Indian culture, and he couldn't tell me from India. So, with the sari and everything. So he co-opted me to be what you might call his kind of pilot. He was a world-class polo player. Little man, huge horses, like they had at the time, Arabian horses. But he rode it like a champion. And he was the star of the whole polo element in northern Nigeria. But the problem with northern Nigeria is that it was on the edge of the Sahara, so the topography was sand.
Right, for polo, yes.
Yes. So when they played polo, what anybody on the periphery saw were clouds of sand going this way and then clouds of sand coming this way. And nobody could tell if anyone had won a goal because you couldn't see through the curtain, So the emir had a bright idea and he made me his goalkeeper. And I had to stand on one side wearing my sari with the long train behind. And whenever I saw a goal go by, my job was to wave it. And whoever the team was got the prize.
Gosh, what fun.
Oh, it was so much fun.
He sounds a very fun character.
He was a very fun character.
And did he, I've also been, coincidentally, when I was, as it were, looking up these pictures, I was reading Gerald Durrell on his role.
Oh, yes.
Did the emir drink a lot?
Barfoot.
Yes,
He was the Barfoot Beagle.
Yes. Did your emir
No,
drink a
he
lot?
didn't.
No.
He didn't.
He was a good Muslim.
He was a very good Muslim.
Lots
I
of wives?
understand 15.
All right.
Yeah, and about 30, 40 children.
Really? Right.
Yeah. All of whom I taught.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
The girls, that is. And he liked me because of the Indian connection. So he would invite me into his wives' quarters. And I was one of the very few expatriates who got to see inside a Muslim emir's quarters.
Right. Gosh.
Yeah.
It must have been great.
So I
fun.
went into the wives' quarters and it's all mud. It would come down every monsoon season, though they didn't call it monsoons, and be rebuilt. But it was very well built. And what they did was to collect tin plates, which had been beaten out of some metal in North Africa and painted. And they bought those and stuck them on the walls as dowry for their daughters.
Ah.
So when the emirs traded wives, a certain percentage of the tin plates went along.
Go along, they were precious
Yes,
metal.
yes.
And one thing I found fascinating seeing these two together, Gerald Durrell and you as it were,
Yeah.
is that, when one read about Africa, the royalty is left out completely.
Yes,
but
it
you
is.
realized how important it was. Obviously after the British left, the politicians took over. And the royalty were left out. But I realized, including when I traveled in Uganda, that the royalty still continues.
Oh, yes. That's a very interesting observation because at the time we were there, it was so divided. Administration was British and the cultural was the emir. And never the twain did meet.
And that emir's role has continued in many places,
In many
even without
places.
political power.
I think so.
Right.
I think the emirs and the traditional royalty command a lot of loyalty and come to a pinch, they will go with their traditional leaders. And the British at that time were very careful not to upset the local hierarchy. I think it was because they knew they were leaving. And in fact, I was amused because these houses had to be rebuilt out of mud because that's all they had as a construction. So after the rainy season, the houses had collapsed and they put them up in like few hours and they're as good as new. But what they did was to change the style of architecture. For instance, when we went there, they had already changed government housing to a Muslim floor plan. Instead of having a British floor plan, which would have been a house that would be like this that you and I know, what we got was a central complex with a dining room and a living room and a kitchen, and then 2 wings on each side. And some houses had 4 wings for 4 different wives. So that, they had thought ahead. And so there was the master wing for the Muslim husband and his first wife, and another one for each of the next 3.
And the Brits were putting these things up.
They were. I had a little chuckle about that.
Right, yes. But David never thought of getting a second wife for the next.
No, I'd have,
you would have beaten him up.
I would have beaten him up, yeah.
Right. One thing that struck me perfectly coincidentally, I thought that your life as a Sri Lankan with a British husband was quite an isolated life from other Sri Lankans, whatever your British company or your fellows. Because there were very few Sri Lankans.
It was the British Foreign Service that.
But then you wrote with regard to another mutual cousin of ours, Frank's wife, Rosemary, who was English. Frank Wickramasinghe was.
Yes.
And you said you met out there. How did that happen?
Oh, well, that was just one of the highlights of my life. Because we were in northern Nigeria, they were in northern Ghana. Nothing went this way, everything went that way. So to meet, though we were not that far apart sidewise, we had to go down to Lagos, they had to go down to Accra. They were in northern Ghana, we were in northern Nigeria, we went down and then we crossed. And then we went up so we would see how the others were living.
So you saw each other's houses as well?
Yeah, not the houses, but we saw the terrain and all of that.
And were they very different? Because Ghana is not desert, is it?
And it's not Muslim.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, and it's not quite as... no, I think ours was more different.
Right.
Frank was a physician, and his job, we were just government people. We didn't have any surprises, but he did, because up there in the north of Ghana, he had no supplies. And and he had to treat, he was the only person for 100 miles in any direction. So he had a tremendously interesting life. He used to describe how much improvisation.
But he'd taken the job under the British colonial system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, he was also, and he and his wife Rosemary.
Yes.
Was Cornish, I think.
Yes.
Wonderfully adventurous couple as well.
Yes. They were lovely, and she had been a teacher. She was British, she had been a teacher in Britain, but she fitted right in, Yeah. Actually, I'm ashamed to say that she learned to cook curry a lot faster than I did.
Yes, because you had never cooked before.
I had never cooked before, so she gave me lessons in cooking Sri Lankan.
Of course, after Nigeria, which was this very exotic place, you moved to somewhere else that, of course, is now associated with a great deal of sophistication. But from the little I know, Malaysia, or rather Malaya as it then was also quite a primitive place way back in the early 60s. So when did you leave Nigeria, and why? And how did you find Malaya after that?
I'm trying to think what the year was. I think it was something like between 63 and 65.
So you had about 4 years in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Which was absolutely fun, totally new in our experience. But we thought we were now ready to try something else which was totally new, but not necessarily that different.
Right.
And from Sri Lanka, we had always admired Malaysia.
Right.
They, at the time, they had many of the same same sorts of things that were happening here. They had the Chinese, the Tamils, and the Malays, and we had problems developing between our ethnic communities. So we were interested in that, and we thought it would be interesting to see, compared with northern Nigeria, they were way ahead. I mean, they were technologically superior. They had all the textbooks they needed to reach a high level of education, which none of the children in northern Nigeria had at the time. Hausa is not a language in which you write technology, you know, but Chinese and Tamil are. So these kids had a drive that I never saw in the laid-back lifestyle. It was a very pleasant lifestyle in northern Nigeria. But Malaya was
much more
driven.
provocative. But is that, you know, you mentioned, interesting, the Chinese and the Tamils.
Yeah.
Were they much more energetic than the Malays?
They were.
Right.
They were. And it's strange, isn't it, why some nations seem to develop certain characteristics, or the Malays were fantastic artists. I mean, we would go to exhibits of Malay art and it was just fabulous. The Chinese were gaudy, I thought.
Right.
And the Indians, you know, they had a large culture behind them, but they developed in their different streams. But at our time, they were very compatible. I don't think the inner tensions had begun. But 10 years later, when we had left and were looking back, we could see that it was all there. The Chinese were driven. I mean, they wanted something, they got out there, they were highly intelligent, they did it. The Tamils did too, and in different ways, because they excelled in different things. The Malays were artistic,
Right.
which neither of the other two were, and they concentrated on their wonderful art, their Islamic art. So for us,
economically, they got left behind, I suppose.
they got left behind. Yeah, there was nothing, except politically they were, they outran the other two. So as life went on, that political advantage began to take over.
Right.
And I think that was what caused the tensions between the three races, because the other two were more driven and the Malays were not, but they outnumbered all of the other
And they had
races.
all the political power, I think.
Yeah, and enjoyed the political power.
But Sean, I didn't check with you exactly where you were in Malaya. And what sort of job again was it? Teaching, I presume, but what sort of school?
When we were in Nigeria, David was working for the British colonial government. And then when we went to Malaya, we were working for the Malaysian government, who were hiring especially teachers from Britain in English, because independence had just come. And they knew that a lot of their future was going to depend on the level of English. It hadn't got politicized, you know, like in Sri Lanka, the language of English got politicized into a whole lot of mess, and later on it happened.
No, we threw it away, whereas the Malays started
We did.
going ahead with it,
Yeah.
even better than before at independence.
I know.
I know, it's
And
stunning how sad we were.
it was so sad because we were way ahead.
Yeah.
And that kind of happened in Malaya, but you know, the Chinese were determined to keep hold of that advantage because they could see that if they needed jobs, they needed an international language. Like Sinhalese, Malay is not an international language. It's really not developed very well.
Much less than ours.
Much less than ours, yeah. So, and Indonesia shares the language, but Indonesia is Dutch-based.
Right.
So really, we were trying to read Malay, which is a simple language, in Indonesian, and Malay in Britain is English-based.
Right.
So they hardly look the same, you know, though they were the Bahasa Indonesia was what they called it.
Yeah.
and they taught them that in place of English, but the ones who really wanted to go ahead
Yeah.
would have gone into the English stream and stayed there.
So David taught English when he was there, or did he teach
We had
subjects in
to
English?
we had to do what we were told, basically. But I think he did most of the history, the English, the geography, and I did English too, and English literature. And I was extremely proud because all my girls passed with an A
Right.
in the
Fantastic.
A levels
And
in English
Shakespeare and all
literature.
that.
Yes.
Right. But where were you? In fact, not Kuala Lumpur, I presume. Because
No,
I can't imagine
Taiping.
both of you being in a.
No, it was a place called Taiping.
Oh, I've been there.
Have you really?
Yes, yes.
Didn't you come and see us?
No, I was too young then. You were there in the early 60s, weren't you? Mid
It was
60s.
Frank, I think. It was Frank who came.
No.
Yeah.
I was there much later. But I still remember, and I don't know whether you remember the place, I think it was near Taiping, the Maxwell Rest House.
Maxwell-
Rest House. It was
Max-
famous, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was right up above our house.
A beautiful
We were
place.
at the bottom of the hill on Maxwell's Hill. It was like Nooreli. It was a bunch of holiday houses.
Right.
And we were at the bottom, and you could only take a jeep up
Right.
to the top of Maxwell's.
Right.
So we would go, for most weekends and things. It was like going to Nooreli in half an hour.
Right.
Because you went
Fantastic.
straight up
Yeah.
in the jeep. Yeah.
Then, what was the social life like? Now, from what you told me, the work in Nigeria was very much with your friends, if you see what I mean. Meaning your peers in the colonial service. But in Malaysia, what was it like? The Brits had gone, or the British administrators
Oh,
had
yes.
gone?
But they were vastly more educated
Right.
than the Nigerians. They'd been exposed
Right.
to the European culture, which was, like us, the Dutch, the British, the Portuguese.
Right.
So they had a good grasp of all things European.
Right.
And that had given them a breadth of knowledge that had never been available to the Nigerians.
So was your social life with Malays mainly, or were there still lots of expatriate planters and all that? Or?
There were quite a lot of expatriate teachers, planters. It was a very good place to live.
Taiping Shan, where you said you were, is quite some distance from Kuala Lumpur.
Yes.
So I was wondering what type of social life you had. When you were talking about Nigeria, you were part of the colonial establishment, you had fellow school teachers, all that.
Yes.
Some of them were hired as colonial administrators, like, not administrators, colonial
Like our
service.
headmaster, yes.
Yeah, and so on. But what was social life like in Taiping? I mean, what were your colleagues like? Were there other English people? Were they Tamils? Because I know a lot of Tamils went from Sri Lanka to teach in Malaya.
Yes, they did.
And
It's
how did you interact with them?
It was kind of different because with Nigeria, you were of the country or you were not out of the country. Not of the country. It was different in Malaysia because the Chinese were new compared with the Malays, and they had been there forever as well. So we had the Malays, the Tamils, and the Chinese, who were not at daggers drawn at all. They were friendly with each other, they helped each other, they each had different skills, and that worked well.
So were your friends, say, whom you'd have for dinners and so on, from that community or from the expatriates?
Now that's again a very interesting question because in Nigeria, we never asked any Nigerian to our house because they would not have come, because the male element would have come, but the women would not have come. And I was invited to the emir's wives' houses, but not David. So there was no real communication between the communities. Quite different in Malaysia, just like the society here. The Chinese, the Malays, the Indians, we who were expatriate, there was no difference. We were all equally sort of educated. Most of us had degrees from somewhere, and we taught languages or whatever was required by the syllabus. So it was a whole different atmosphere,
It must have been fascinating
It
to
was
have worked in both
fascinating.
these different places.
Yes, to have moved from one to the other.
And what about the leftover Brits? I mean, were there still some administrators who stayed on?
Yes, our headmaster, who was quite a character as Brits can be, he lasted as headmaster. He had a huge head of red hair, and he was the joke of the entire school, but he was a lovely man.
Right.
Then we had someone called Ralph Wingfield, who came when the others were leaving. He came fresh,
Right.
but he came with a girlfriend.
Right.
And this was to a Muslim country, so he asked us, you see, our house had been planned by the Brits to take in the incoming Muslims.
Yeah.
So my house had a huge living room, a dining room, a summer kitchen and a winter kitchen, and then two large wings on each side. And each side catered to wife number 2 and wife number 3.
Like Nigeria.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, like most of the north there. So the headmaster came and he had not a wife, but a girlfriend. And because of the Muslim sentiments in the area, he said, would you mind if we took this wing? And of course, everyone knew what was going on. So you'd see everybody looking over the fence. So he created quite a sensation, but we tried to keep ourselves quite separate from all of that. So it was very amusing, actually.
And what about the planters?
The planters were okay to the south.
Right.
They were not in where we were.
Typing.
Yeah.
Right.
Typing. Typing was a seaside place. And it was more a holiday resort.
Right.
And Penang was the big, everyone crossed the little strait and went to Penang.
Right. But what made you leave then? How long were you there and when did you leave?
We were there, we were for the full period of the contract.
Which is 3 years?
3 years.
Right.
And then we could have renewed it, but David decided he wanted to do his doctorate.
Right.
So we gave that up and we thought of going back. But in the end, you know, you do your PhD, and then he had various offers from other universities, and we never did go back.
And presumably, did you have a family in Malaysia, or did the family start after you got
After, yeah.
Which was where? Did you do the
Sarah
doctorate?
was born in Madison, Wisconsin.
That's where he did his doctorate.
Yeah,
Right.
where we
And
taught.
then you just stayed on.
And we stayed on there. It was a very pleasant place.
Did you teach? Did he teach there?
Yes,
or did you,
yes. Both of us did.
And then after that you moved to Canada, did you?
And after that, David decided he wanted to do his PhD. So we moved to
medicine
Canada.
was a master's, was it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And then Canada was the PhD at
Yeah.
where? At,
The University of Western Ontario
right.
in London.
Oh, right. And then you stayed on in London.
And then we stayed on in London. Yeah, it was a pleasant place to bring up children, you know.
Right.
It
And by
was-
then you had a second.
Yeah.
But she was born in Britain, I believe.
No,
Anjali, no, Canada.
Yeah,
In London.
in London, Ontario.
Right.
And Sarah was born in Wisconsin.
It's that. I remember.
So Sarah carries 3 passports. She carries British, Canadian, and American.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Right. And Anjali has the 2.
Yes, and just the 2.
Because, of course, what was interesting is that although we are technically third cousins, which is a distant relationship, we share a great-great-grandfather. But, you know, I met you so often when I was in Oxford.
Yes.
And you and David came to Cambridge quite often, didn't you?
Yeah. Well,
what,
we were in
sabbaticals or-
Cambridge. We came to see you in
You
Oxford.
came and stayed with me in Oxford, and I came and stayed with you in
And
Cambridge.
I know you made a delightful pot roast. Have you forgotten your pot roast?
No, I was a good cook in those days. I
Yes,
mean,
you
nothing
were.
ever turned out the same twice.
Yeah.
But it was
that-
always fun.
I will never forget that pot roast, which you did on the top of a 2-burner thing
Yes, we had a very simple
in your
oven.
crummy little student.
And I think I put all 4 of you in my bedroom
I think you did.
and shared the sitting room with my friend who normally slept there.
Yeah,
And we had a party there once.
that was very fun.
And
Yeah,
your little daughter,
yeah.
the elder daughter was very sensible. She retired to the bedroom and read.
Yes,
And the elder daughter sat on our round table
yes.
and just looked at everybody.
She was a peculiar kid. Her favorite way of traveling was in the wastebasket.
Really?
Yes, we had a round wastebasket and she sat in it, wouldn't go in the car unless we put her in the wastebasket on the back
What a
seat.
splendid child.
Yes.
I think when she wandered round my party,
Yes.
she partook of whatever people
She
eating and
drank a
drinking.
lot.
Yes, I think she just tasted
yes,
everything.
she tasted everything. Yeah.
No, but those were fun days.
Yeah.
But tell me, David also obviously had a great sense of adventure. So tell me about him. I mean, how did you meet him? What was his background? Because although he
Well-
looked very British,
Yeah.
I
was
think he was very
different.
cosmopolitan.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Odd you should ask that, because when I went to Cambridge, my father said, I will take you to number 3 St. Clement's Gardens, which is where I was a student. And when David went to Cambridge, his father said, I will take you to see Mrs. Clements, Mrs. Smith, who used to be my landlady.
Yeah.
So we arrived on the doorstep at the same time. I to number 3 and David to Mrs. Smith.
Was number 3.
Yeah.
Right,
It was the
gosh.
same place.
Right.
We entered Cambridge in 1955, and the Brits didn't really believe in women's education, so they had put Girton College, which was at that time the only all-women's college, 3 miles out of town on the Trumpington Road. And we Girtonians had to cycle in and somehow get into town and attend lectures wearing our gowns, because we had to wear gowns all the time as well, the long black gown. So there I was with a sari. I wasn't going to wear trousers because for some reason I didn't go for that. I didn't want to wear a skirt, so I wore my sari. And I wore my sari with bicycle clips and this train flowing behind me. So I was quite a sight on the streets of Cambridge when I went cycling in with this flag behind me, But then the strange thing was that I had to change somewhere because I couldn't go to a lecture like that.
Why? Couldn't you go in a sari?
Why wouldn't... No, I think I had to wear the skirt. Yes.
To sari? To
With
lectures?
the gown.
Right.
Yeah. They weren't very happy
Yeah.
with the sari. This was a long time ago now, So my father said, I will take you to the house of my landlady, because he had been in Cambridge. And she will look after you and give you a solution. And then my father said, I used to live at 3 St. Clement's Gardens. Let's see what they're offering. So, of course, the 2 fathers, 2 children arrived at the front door at the same time. And that's how I met my husband.
Yes,
because
David's father brought him to his lodging.
Yeah.
And David stayed there, in fact.
David lived there, yeah.
So, and Mrs. Clements gave you a room to change in, did she?
Yes, because I had to come down from Girton wearing whatever I was wearing that they would allow me to wear without the gown. It was so complicated.
No, I think you didn't wear a skirt simply because you wanted an excuse to go and see David.
After a while, yeah.
Yes. But he was 1 year senior to you, was he?
He was, yeah.
Right. So, and
But
from the day you met, it just took off, did it?
no, not at all. Didn't notice him one little bit.
Really?
Yes, because I loved the landlady.
Right.
And she would make cakes for her male students who
Right.
lived with her. And I used to laugh because she'd make these cakes in a great big bowl. And then suddenly she had all the socks to wash
Right.
of her male students. So she'd take all the pudding mix out, dump it, put the socks in, wash them, take the socks out and dry them and put the pudding back in. She,
So the pudding was flavored.
it was flavored, yeah. Never ate any of her puddings after
Right.
that.
Right.
But it was kind of fun.
Right.
And
then
I used to change there
Right.
because I cycled in and then I wore my gown and all the paraphernalia that we had to wear at the time.
So when did you start taking notice of David, or vice versa?
About the 3rd year in.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
His 3rd year, which was your 2nd year.
Which was my 2nd year, yeah.
He was gone by the, yeah.
Yes, and he was in the University of London doing his certificate in education.
Right, when you were doing your...
Yeah, because he had applied for the Foreign Service.
Right.
And they needed something from the University of London, I think, postgraduate certificate in education to allow him to join the civil service to teach in
Right.
the colonies.
But,
Yeah.
David Radcliffe, you can't get a more English name than that.
No.
But I remember your mother telling me when I was learning French from her, that David's aunt was this famous French scholar called Germain
Yes.
Brie. How was that, if he was English?
Well, his Germain's had 6 sisters and 1 brother.
And they were French.
They were all totally French from the south of France.
Right,
Then one of the sisters was a chemist,
right,
and she ended up marrying David's father, who was British.
right.
And so Germaine, who was nothing to do with the French, the British side of the family, came over to learn English.
Right.
And she just excelled in everything. And now she is the definitive writer on 20th century
Yes, she was very famous.
French literature. And she was godmother to our children, and really took us under her wing and looked after us, and made sure we were fine.
What was the Channel Islands connection?
Her mother was a Channel Islander,
Right.
and her father was a Parisian Huguenot priest from the south of France.
Oh, right. So the Channel Island lady went to live in the south of France.
Yes.
But there was still a sort of British connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So-
then David's mother was this French lady.
Was this French
but
lady?
half Channel Islands.
Yes, and I think they still have rights to living in the Channel Islands, because they are very particular about people needing a birth justification,
Right.
because they're so afraid of overpopulation.
Right.
So we went, what was it, St. Peter Port, I think. We went and just, looked at it. Lovely little
Saw the old
place.
place. Yes, no, it must be fun. I've never been to the Channel Islands, but they sound
No.
delightful.
Yeah.
And then Germaine went off to America, didn't she?
She's written about 20 books. She's the definitive author on Gilles, Camus, Sartre, all of them.
Because what was interesting is, the name Germaine Brie came back to me because, when I was looking after your mother's house, as I still think of it,
Yeah.
I found all these books.
Yeah.
And amongst them, there were books by Germaine Brie, and I thought I knew that name.
Yeah.
So I asked, and you said she was David's aunt.
Yeah.
And then there was another great French scholar whose parents came to see your mother.
Elaine Marx.
Yes.
Elaine Marx, yeah.
And she
They
and Germaine were great friends. I
were
think.
great. She had been a student of Germaine's.
Right.
Germaine had a magnificent life because she volunteered in the Second World War with the French army. And her job was to translate for the French general who was leading them up through France to England. She translated all the way for her, got the Legion of Honor for her
Yeah.
contribution, and went on to write sort of the definitive books on Gide and
Yes,
Sartre
no, I
and
saw that,
Camus
yeah.
and all of them. So she was the one who got us actually to the University of Wisconsin.
Because she was there as well, was she?
Yeah,
Oh, right. So that's the Madison,
connection.
Wisconsin connection.
yeah. She was given a scholar, an honorary scholarship, which meant that they paid a huge sums of money to just live there.
Right. Yes.
She didn't have to write, she didn't have to do anything. It was one of those
Yeah.
really fantastic
Because Madison
things.
was expanding at that time,
Yes.
in the 60s, and getting, trying to compete with the East Coast and all that. Wasn't it?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was a good time to be there.
it
And
was.
Elaine Marx was also there or not?
Elaine Marx was a star student, yeah.
She was at Madison, or?
Yes, she was also at
Oh,
Madison.
Right.
And Germaine is the godmother of my elder daughter, and Elaine is the godmother of my younger
What
daughter.
fun. Because,
Yeah.
amongst the memorabilia I picked up,
Yeah.
and I must give it to you, is a wonderful menu of a Cunard lunch when you and
Really?
the Marx parents sailed out
Oh,
together.
I would have loved to.
No, it's there. I must find it for you again. But did you come out to Sri Lanka together? Or to Ceylon,
Yes,
as
they
it was?
came. They came.
Right, so that's how
Yes.
your mother met them and became such a good
Yes, such
friend.
good friends with them. When you say a last menu of a Cunard liner, I think of the one that went down.
Wonderful
That wasn't
lunches.
it.
Well,
Yeah.
that was the
Yeah.
Titanic. But no, because again, what struck me, here's you having this wonderfully cosmopolitan life
Yeah.
with this very cosmopolitan husband who
Mm-hmm.
ventured from Cambridge to Nigeria to Malaysia.
Yeah.
Although he then, I suppose sensibly enough really, settled down in the West because you had the two children to bring up.
Yeah, that
And it
was
made
the
sense, I think.
that was the
But then what struck me, Shan, I'm always more than impressed by her, is how your mother, who was this quiet Sri Lankan housewife, had this wonderful cosmopolitan approach to life. Because
Second
she
coming
learned
almost.
French.
Yes.
And was that to do with meeting Germain and...
I think a lot of it had to do with that.
Yeah.
And the fact that my brother was enrolled in the Sorbonne at the same time.
No, but she learned French earlier, because he went to the Sorbonne in the 60s, didn't he? He was there
Yes,
during the...
yes, he was in the 60s.
So that's what I had also thought. That,
Right,
that
right.
he,
You are
he
correct.
inspired her French.
Right.
But she was reading French long before.
Long before, yes, you're absolutely right. And she did so well
Yeah,
that she was able to teach it.
yeah.
And the Alliance Française would send her their brightest pupils when they had outgrown what they were teaching at the Alliance
Right.
to my mother. And in fact, she also took to painting. There are paintings all over
Yes,
this
there
house.
are some hanging on the staircase outside this
Yeah.
room. There are some in the porch under
Right.
my, just outside
Overhang
this building,
there.
the other half of my
Yeah.
house, as it were. And I'm just so impressed
She was amazing,
by her
wasn't she?
talent.
Yeah,
Because she was, I wouldn't say a simple girl, because her father was a member of the Legislative Assembly and all
Yeah.
that. But she married very young.
yes, yes.
And obviously your father, who was a very distinguished civil servant, gave her head, as it were, to read.
She read voraciously.
Yeah. And your
Everything she
library
could.
was full of books that I had, thought were your children's books.
No.
But she chose them all, and I think
Yeah.
she gave you, as a child, books that were far beyond a child.
My capabilities, anyway.
Yeah. And I think she just
But-
bought them to read herself.
I think
to
she
me,
did.
one of the, well, perhaps the funniest, was that I was reading the story of Saint Michel,
Yes.
which your mother had gifted to your brother when he was 2 years old.
Oh dear,
She
oh
just
dear.
bought it to read for herself, or perhaps
Of course she
and
did.
you read it.
Yeah.
Because there are lots about animals there. and
Right.
So on.
Yeah.
But it's also about prostitutes in
Of course.
France and affairs with countessers and so on.
I wonder-
And imagine your poor little brother of 1.5
Yeah.
being read to with all these stories about illicit affairs in Paris and in Rome.
Yeah. Yeah. I
But it
can't really see it.
But it must have been a really remarkable upbringing that you
Yes.
had with those parents.
I wish she had been born just a little later, because I think her generation, like your grandmother's, was one where if you had a husband who was in the kind of jobs that Uncle Cyril was, and that was your job.
Yes.
You supported them.
Yeah.
And any other talents you may have had to take second place.
And perhaps that's why she read so much and
She
lived
read so
in an
much.
entirely different world with, there are millions of books by Robert Louis Stevenson, who was the great romantic, of course.
Yes.
And I have visions of her,
Yeah.
traveling across the American plains
Yes.
and taking travels with a donkey in the
Travels with a
Cevennes.
donkey, yeah. Yeah.
And I think
Amazing.
that living through books, she was lucky enough to transmit to you that
Yes.
love of life and different places.
Yeah.
And you managed to live it up.
I did. People say if they have a picture of me at all, you remember the Rodrigos had a spiral staircase. They lived next door to us.
Yeah, Edmund Rodrigo was that.
Edmund Rodriguez, yeah. And I used to go to their house. They had these million books, and they say they found 5 years when I was there,
Right.
day and night, reading
Really?
books. Yeah.
And this was in
It
Colombo?
was in Colombo,
one
yeah,
of
on
those
Fifth Lane.
wonderful civil service houses,
Yes.
was it?
Yeah.
Sean, I think it was really very interesting that we should have looked at your mother and her enormous zest for life. But it was also sad that, as you put it, this had to be fulfilled through books, through her painting, which was wonderful, through her marvelous knowledge of French, and then her sinking into French culture
Yes.
in such a big way. Because, of course, that I think was the foundation for the wonderful life you led, and this great, fantastic range of activity that you were able to throw yourself into.
I'm sure it was. She was one of those women who was endlessly fascinated by every place she went to, every book she read. I know certainly that the books that she introduced me to were just amazing. I mean, I knew Italy and Rome when I was 5, I think,
Yes, no,
because she was so enchanted by the place.
no, she had that
Yeah,
range. And it was
yeah.
wonderful that you had that range.
Yes,
But were
she,
also be able to fulfill it with all this travel
yes.
and all these experiences. So Sean, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating romp around the world.
Thank you very much. And it's been great just going through this together because you've had the same family, the same kind of life. It's been great.
Thank you.
Yeah.